In our last lecture, we found out that the unfinished business of World War I essentially gave rise to World War II. We'll discuss more of what historians call the unsettled peace as the World War II years begin approaching. What I want to focus on in this lecture would be the impact that World War I will make on the American home front. We've essentially fought the war, and what I want to do today is talk to you about how the war will change life in America here at home. On the most basic of levels, what World War I is going to do is it's going to expand the role, scope, and power of the federal government. You're going to feel the government more during the war. You will see it, you will hear it. Government will become more powerful during the war. There's a very specific reason as to why. The federal government is the only institution in American life that really has the capacity and especially the resources to mobilize the American people for victory in the war, right? To get everybody on the same page, that's much easier said than done. It was not going to be done city by city or even region by region. It's going to have to come from the federal levels of government. On another very basic level, one of the big tasks that society is going to have to do when it comes to this war is pay for it. You got to pay for wars. And to that end, the government is going to be instrumental. We are going to pay for a third of the war by tapping the private resources or the private incomes of wealthier Americans. What the 16th Amendment does is it implements an income tax on wealthy Americans and corporations. It pretty much leaves alone middle and working class people. They're not going to have the luxury of paying income taxes until World War II, but this does set a precedent when it comes to income taxes that we still live with here today. But the 16th Amendment is a good example of how government is expanding and becoming more powerful during the war years. The other way that we'll pay for the war is by selling Liberty loans. These are government bonds that are designed to raise money for the war. And if you're following along in the PowerPoint here with me, you can see that soldier that's tacking up an advertisement for these war bonds. And one of the groups of Americans that are buying these things up like they're going out of style, that would be American immigrants. I mean, what better way to wear your patriotism on your sleeve and demonstrate your commitment to this country than literally investing in the war effort. And so these war bonds sold like hotcakes, and collectively we're able to raise an enormous amount of money for the war effort. It's going to be instrumental in our success in World War I. Another venture that the government is trying to undertake would be informing Americans as to what's going on over in Europe. You have to understand that for most Americans, Europe was another universe. They had only really read about it. Many people had not been there. And so what you see is the establishment of the Committee on Public Information, or CPI for short. And what the CPI is designed to do is to educate Americans as to why we're fighting the war, who is on what side, and maybe most important, what's at stake. Why are we doing what we're doing? Initially, the CPI had a lot of very, let's call them tame, bordering on the ridiculous sorts of initiatives. There are some very Germanic sounding words that are used loosely in American English. For example, sauerkraut. You can't call it sauerkraut. We're fighting the Germans. It sounds too Germanic-y, right? So we replaced it. The CPI replaced the term sauerkraut with the idea of liberty cabbage. Well, that's pretty innocent, and maybe it blames Germans a little bit more than it should, but certainly it's not all that dangerous. The problem is that the CPI is going to quickly become a vigilante element in American life. Keep in mind, guys, America had a huge German American population, and it wasn't all that widespread. But what you can see here is what starts out as Liberty Cabbage ultimately will degenerate into violence, in some cases lynchings. And German Americans on the whole were very, very, patriotic Americans. Perhaps even more concerning is this growth of government power. Because there was such a huge German American population, there were a lot of people that felt that this group was selling out American secrets to our enemies. They were giving vital military, agricultural, economic secrets to the Germans. And so the government needed to keep a better eye on them. Enter into our conversation the Espionage Act. Now, the Espionage Act is a dramatic growth of government power because what it's going to do is it's going to give the government a lot more sweeping authority to monitor American behavior. In particular, what we're looking for here is German spies, and the great irony is that the Espionage Act, which is designed to curb the use of spying, does so by spying on the American people. It's a very clear-cut violation of some of the more basic levels of the Bill of Rights, civil rights, and civil liberties. And the only thing worse than the Espionage Act would be the Sedition Act in 1918. Sedition, the overthrowing of the government, was painted with a very broad brush by Woodrow Wilson. And so, of course, it can be used against people that are, in fact, trying to overthrow the US government, but it can also be used as a weapon to come after Wilson's political enemies. Quick example, and again, if you're following along with me at the PowerPoint, if you look at that bottom image of that ransacked office, that would be the headquarters of the industrial workers of the world. They are very anti-war and they don't care who knows it. It's the IWW that's leading demonstrations that are anti-war, anti-Woodrow Wilson in their orientation, and Wilson is using that as an excuse to come after them and prosecute them under the guise of the Sedition Act, that their freedom of speech is ultimately being suspended essentially for the good of the war effort. And so you can see both the Espionage and the Sedition Acts are very good, and I mean this in a bad way, examples of the growth of government, which is eroding American freedom and civil rights in American life. We also begin to see the government try to regulate the economy and transition it into a wartime economy. This will come to be known as the business government partnership, and that's going to have a lot of insinuations for the and implications for the 1920s. You'll see what I'm talking about a little bit later. But for right now, I want to draw your attention to the War Industries Board, the WIB. I don't know about you, but the people that I would want organizing a wartime economy would be the CEOs, CFOs, the corporate executives that are running institutions like US Steel, like American Tobacco, like General Motors, right? Bring those guys, those officers, bring them to Washington and have them help you organize your economy. They're organizing these multinational corporations, so clearly they've got skills that will be highly, helpful for the war effort. What the WIB is essentially going to do is it is going to be given the power to allocate resources to make sure that our fighting men in Europe have enough food, enough bullets, enough boots, all that good stuff, but to also ensure that our civilian population doesn't starve either. They also have the power to forcibly shut down producers and convert their production facilities into wartime productions. Now, they don't really want to do that. What they would like are people like Henry Ford to do this voluntarily. And in a lot of ways, the government really makes them an offer that is too good to be true. We're going to give you, Henry Ford, a monopoly on the best customer anywhere in the world. That would be the federal government. We're essentially going to ensure your profits. What we want you to do is to stop making Model Ts and start making Jeeps, start making bullets, start making guns, start making helmets, start producing for the war. Because the Fords and DuPonts and the Carnegies and the Rockefellers of the world are able to produce on such a massive level, we want them to produce for the war, and that's ultimately going to be very instrumental when it comes to our success in World War I. World War II as well, but that's another story for another class. As I said before, the government has this power, but it's hoping never to have to use that power. Keep in mind, although we're seeing this regulatory state growing in the progressive era, the idea of too much government involvement in the economy was a bad thing. That's still a very powerful concept in American life, even as late as the 19 teens, right? A very good example as to what I'm talking about would be the guy that's running the Food Administration, very important agency in Washington, guy by the name of Herbert Hoover. Hoover has this really difficult task to make sure that we have enough food here at home, but we're supplying our armies as well as our allies' armies as well. Hoover had the power to say, I'm sorry, everybody, but you're just not going to be able to eat any red meat for the duration of the war. It's needed for the war effort. He has that power. But what he's hoping that Americans will do is to make these sacrifices voluntarily. This idea comes to be known as volunteerism, and it's got a very specific campaign with that respect. That would be the idea known as Meatless Mondays. What the Food Administration would do is go on this public relations tour. They would knock on doors and they would say, Sir or ma'am, we're here from the Food Administration in Washington, and we're asking all patriotic Americans to voluntarily not eat meat on Monday. We're calling it Meatless Mondays, and we're going to have Wheatless Tuesdays, and we're going to have Porkless Wednesdays. And the idea being appeal to Americans out of patriotism and get them to voluntarily stop eating meat, at least on certain days throughout the week. This, in turn, would conserve resources and it would ensure that we were able to send our armies as well as our allies' armies all that extra food. And it's going to be absolutely critical in the war effort. And this is a concept that comes out of Herbert Hoover's Food Administration, volunteerism. But more importantly, it's a pretty good example when it comes to the approach of the federal government during the war years. They don't want to use that power unless they absolutely have to. I want to switch gears here for a second and talk about a cultural movement that would be very much inspired by World War I, and that would be modernism. Now, the first thing I want you to know about modernism is that this is not born in the United States. Modernism is a cultural expressionist movement, an artistic movement that will really start in Europe and be brought to the United States around about the time that World War I is heating up. Okay? So it's not American, it's European in its orientation, but it would be deeply influential to the American people. Okay? Modernism takes as its influences industrialization, urbanization, World War I. All of these you might lump into the category of controversial. And I don't really mean controversial so much as I mean that beauty was in the eye of the beholder. For example, some people might look at those tenements that we've talked about in the cities, Chicago, New York, and say those are gross, those are disgusting, those are ugly. And other people might find beauty in these laundry lines, these clotheslines that are going back and forth from these windows of these tenements. People might find that to be beautiful. The symmetry of the Ford River Rouge facility, for example, poetry in motion. So it really is in the eyes of the beholder, but that was very influential to that group of American expressionists. Some of you may know the couple that I've got featured there in that PowerPoint slide. The man is a guy by the name of F. Scott Fitzgerald. Many of you may have read his work, probably The Great Gatsby. The lady sitting next to him is his lovely wife, Zelda. And if you know anything about The Great Gatsby, you know it's not a very happy story. Many aspects of modernism, whether we're talking about art or photography, literature, poetry, they don't exactly have happy endings, right? Certainly, that's the case with The Great Gatsby. Um, this is the direct influence that World War One would play in this cultural movement known as modernism. If you know anything about the story, Great Gatsby, World War One does have a role to play within that. And the main character, Gatsby, did very, very well in the war, won a lot of awards and medals. And part of the reason was that he had lost the love of his life and he was trying to get himself killed. And this generation of Americans is referred to as the lost generation, that generation that fought World War One, called the lost generation. Now, it partly is because Europeans literally lost a generation of young men. But there's a psychological, metaphorical element to this as well. The lost generation, lost souls, and certainly Fitzgerald would fall into that category. But getting back to the war and the war effort, you can have all the Henry Fords producing morning, noon, and night. You can have all of them that you want to sign your agreements. It's not going to amount to anything if you don't have workers tending those machines and cranking out the stuff morning, noon, and night. And I don't know about you, but if you were somebody like Jurgis Rudkis, what I would want would be a union. A union will get you better pay, or at least negotiate better pay, negotiate safer working conditions, will give you a voice on the factory floor. There's all kinds of different things that a union can do for you. But if you've been paying attention to the lectures in our class so far, for the most part, government is no friend of the unions. If anything, government has been used to break apart unionization efforts. That'll change, at least temporarily, it'll change in World War One when government legalizes unions. The National Labor Relations Board will serve as an arbitrator, like a referee, between organized labor, unions, and their bosses, the people like Henry Ford that own the factories. And what the NLRB is going to say is that if your boss, Henry Ford, takes $1 of federal aid for the war, federal money, then by law, he needs to recognize your union and bargain in good faith with you. And so workers are looking at the future with high hopes and high expectations. One reason is because hundreds of thousands of dues paying, union card carrying union members come out of the war. And they're looking at the future, the 1920s, with high hopes and high expectations that for the first time, really in American history, the government seems to be on the side of the workers. Their hopes are going to be dashed, and I'll get into that a little bit later. Another thing that the war is going to lead to is this process known as the Great Migration. Now, what I mean by the Great Migration would be African Americans coming up from the rural South to fill these labor needs, these labor shortages in the urban North. St. Louis, Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Buffalo, Philadelphia, Boston, New York. These are all going to become what historians call black metropolises. They're all going to see their black populations explode during the war years, and there's a very simple reason for that. Many of these men that had been working in factories like in Detroit, they've enlisted in the war and they're now going over and they're fighting in Europe. And so we have the need for warm bodies in the factories. At the same time, the conditions in the rural South, in Mississippi, in Georgia, in Florida, simply put, are oppressive. You're talking about a region at a time period where black men couldn't vote. The schools are abysmal, and that is if you have the luxury of sending your kids to school. The long and short of this is that there's a freedom in the North that simply does not exist in the South. And so it's not just the appeal of jobs, although making a lot more money than a sharecropper in Mississippi would. That's certainly appealing, but there's a social freedom that African Americans are longing for, and a lot of people are looking to the North to fulfill those freedoms. And once again, when they get there, similar to workers, their hopes are going to be dashed a little bit. The last group that's looking to the future with a little bit of hope would be American women. Even the Great Migration could not fill the labor shortage created by the war. And women begin to enter into the paid workforce, into factory work, industrial work, at levels that are unprecedented, that had never been seen before. And so, once again, women are looking at this future with high hopes and high expectations because, in a lot of cases, alongside that economic independence, you're going to see a push for political independence and political rights for women. But I want to talk about these dashed hopes in the time that we have remaining. You have to understand that what the Great Migration did to some of these urban centers was put an enormous strain on them. And I don't really mean that in a bad way. I just mean that all of a sudden you've got a sharp competition for resources, housing, recreational facilities. All of these things are going to become contested terrain. Let me give you a couple examples. In East St. Louis in 1917, riots broke out when it was felt that African American workers were being given preferential treatment when it comes to hiring. What you've got are armed white mobs that are going into the black community and they're beating people up indiscriminately. Okay. Similarly, in Chicago, a couple years down the road, you've got African American boys, really they're youths, and they're playing in the main uh, entity of public recreation, and that would be the beaches of Lake Michigan. And there were white people that really didn't appreciate that very much. The beaches in Lake Michigan were very racialized during this period. And there's violence, white on black violence that emanates from a competition of resources, who has access to the lake and who doesn't, right? Now, I want to make sure that you're very clear on something. Racial violence was nothing new in American life. What was new was this new racial assertiveness that historians call the New Negro. What the New Negro was a new racial assertiveness where African Americans are not simply going to roll over. When the white mobs came in, the black citizens pushed back and gave as good as they got. And in some cases, what you had were black mobs going into white neighborhoods and beating people up indiscriminately. When I say that these were race riots, they were literally race riots in the sense that you have people of different races fighting each other. And that's going to be something that is brought about by the war. And in the process, the Great Migration is going to put the strain on these urban centers because they're going to have a massive influx of newcomers, African Americans being but one. The other legacy of the end of the war would be a deep and profound fear of radicalism. In 1919, one of the things that you're going to see emerge would be what historians call the Red Scare, a deep and intense fear of radicalism generally and communism in particular. Why communism? Well, in 1917, as I pointed out in the previous lecture, Russia is going to bow out of the war. And part of the reason that it's going to bow out of the war is that the Bolsheviks are going to uh, execute a coup d'etat in Russia. They'll depose the czar and they'll implement a communist regime in a very unlikely place, Russia. And a lot of people in the United States are saying if it can happen there, certainly it can happen here as well. A couple of years down the road, in 1919, what Russia is going to do is it's going to establish this institution that will come to be known as the Comintern, or maybe more appropriately, the International. And the whole point of the Comintern is to export communism to every corner of the globe, including the United States. And this really was scary stuff. The idea that the Russians were actually trying to bring communism to American shores was nothing short of shocking to many, many Americans in the public during this time period. What was even more shocking was the level of class conflict. I mean, 1919, massive wave of strikes, of working class boycotts, of workers fighting their bosses. In Seattle, they implemented something that was called the general strike. Everybody in Seattle just simply walked off their jobs. You didn't have to work too hard to come to maybe the conclusion that this massive amount of class conflict would ultimately result in the same sort of way that it did in Russia, some variation of an American Bolshevik revolution. And one of the individuals that was very concerned about this was America's Attorney General, the top law enforcement official in the land, a guy by the name of A. Mitchell Palmer. And in 1919, Palmer, who was deeply, deeply suspicious of radicals and in particular communists, a bomb exploded at the Palmer residence in Washington. Now, fortunately, nobody within his family was hurt, but Palmer comes to the conclusion that this can only be the work of the communists. This is clearly communist sabotage. And so what Palmer's going to do is he's going to send dozens and dozens of federal law enforcement officials out into American life to arrest anybody that even has some loose affiliation with communism, right? If you ever went to a communist rally or you went to some sort of event, some fundraiser, even if you didn't know that it was sponsored by radicals like communists, you could, and in some cases were, arrested for it. It was guilt by association. But more importantly, this government law enforcement dragnet process comes to be known as the Palmer raids. This is an example, on the one hand, of massive government expansion when it comes to power. And on the other hand, it's an example of the legacy of World War I. You see an unmistakable anti-radical attitude begin to emerge after the war, and certainly the Palmer raids are a good example of that. Now, Palmer doesn't last that long as the Attorney General. He is eventually relieved of his duties, but before he goes, he appoints the guy that you're looking at the bottom right corner of this slide, a guy by the name of J. Edgar Hoover. He appoints Hoover to lead this new bureau in the Justice Department that will later become known as the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And that is going to be a title, Director of the Bureau. It's going to be a title that Hoover is going to keep for decades. It's not going to be until the middle of the 1970s, upon his actual death, that Hoover would no longer be the director of the FBI. Now, I'm hopeful that you know that what the FBI does is investigate criminals, some of whom are domestics, others of whom are operating in the United States, but they're of a foreign variety. They keep an eye on the quote unquote bad guys. Is it a good thing to have an FBI? Sure, it is. Absolutely, it is. I think it is, right? Is there a fine line between investigating and persecuting? No question about it. And J. Edgar Hoover is going to flirt with that line and cross it on numerous different occasions. He is going to compile massive files. He's going to monitor the behavior of dozens and dozens, really hundreds of Americans, and keep these very detailed files on them. I'm not just talking about nameless and faceless workers, not that that would be okay either, but I'm talking about people like the future First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who Hoover clearly thought had un-American activities, well, excuse me, un-American tendencies. Martin Luther King had another very thick file. And according to Hoover, the only real reason that King would want integration, the mixing of the races, is because he himself was a communist. And the civil rights movement was nothing more than a massive communist conspiracy to turn the government over to communism. And so this too, Hoover and the FBI, is going to be a loose legacy of the end of World War I. To give you maybe an exclamation point when it comes to this anti-radical sort of attitude that will crystallize by 1920, I want to point to a case involving two Italian immigrants, a guy by the name of Niccolo Sacco and his friend Bartolomeo Vanzetti. Um, Sacco and Vanzetti are accused of murdering their boss in Braintree, Massachusetts, a crime that both men adamantly deny that they were guilty of. Now, at the time that they were arrested, both men were armed. It was well known that neither man had bothered to apply for U.S. citizenship. They were Italians, which wasn't really all that unusual. If you know anything about Italian immigration, you know that many of them never got around to applying for citizenship, the idea being go back to Italy and buy yourself a farm. But lastly, they were also known to be anarchists, people that wanted to destroy the government. Now, when they went on trial, the trial quickly degenerated into a trial about their anarchism. That because anarchists wanted to destroy the government, they were clearly violent. And because violence was an inherent part, or allegedly an inherent part, of anarchism, both Sacco and Vanzetti were capable of murder. Ipso facto, they are guilty of murder. What I'm going for here, guys, the point that I'm driving at, is that the trial was much more about the Red Scare, the fear of radicalism, including anarchism, than it was anything else. And even when there's pretty compelling evidence that would have absolved Sacco and Vanzetti of the wrongdoing, the judge, who, again, if you're looking at this image, the funeral of Sacco and Vanzetti, you see them at the bottom there, the caskets. If you look over the shoulders of the president of Harvard University, the guy wearing the academic hat there, that's Judge Thatcher. And Judge Thatcher, the presiding judge that was officiating the trial, refused to allow that evidence into court. And in 1921, we will execute Sacco and Vanzetti for murder. They're convicted and later sentenced to death. The case of Sacco and Vanzetti is very emblematic of this anti-radical attitude that had come full circle by 1920. Because many of these individuals that were bringing over radical doctrines like anarchism, socialism, communism, they were from places like Poland, Russia, Italy. There is there's another anti-immigrant sentiment that will accompany this anti-radical sentiment. It's not just that we're fearing radicalism, it's also that we're fearing these immigrants, including the Italians, that are bringing over these radical political doctrines as well. And as you're going to see once we talk about the 1920s, one of the things that there are some groups hard at work at would be enforcing not only patriotic but traditional American values. Okay, some of this is done at work. Some of this is done more or less naturally when we see the emergence of a national culture. And tragically, some of this is done through hate groups. You'll see more what I'm talking about the next time we meet. For right now, I hope you've had a good lecture.